Imagine a world woven not of light and shadow, but of two invisible threads, a golden thread of divine promise and a black thread of stone-like waiting. In the great encampment of the patriarch Abraham, these two threads intertwined relentlessly, pulling taut to create a tapestry of tension so thick the very air seemed to congeal. Here, hostility was not waged with shouting or the clash of swords. It existed in a far more refined and cruel form, a silent symphony performed daily, from the first blush of dawn until the stars ignited the desert sky. And the unwilling conductor of this bitter symphony was a boy named Ishmael. He was not merely an inconvenient truth, the son born of an Egyptian handmaiden. He was a small, warm, and vibrant flame, but his very existence cast a light too bright upon the cold, unhealing wounds in the soul of Sarah. The matriarch of the camp, Ishmael, was unlike other children. His intellect was a subterranean river, running swift and deep beneath a quiet exterior. His dark, discerning eyes did not just see, they observed. His ears did not just hear, they listened, able to distinguish the sigh of the wind through rock crevices from the whisper of sand sliding down a dune. He could sit for hours, utterly still, using a slender stick to trace the complex journey of the clouds upon the canvas of the sand, or use his voice to replicate with startling perfection the cry of an eagle soaring high above. In the twilight of his life, when his own shadow grew long, Abraham found in his firstborn son a reflection of the hope and youth he thought he had lost. The patriarch's love for the boy was a gentle, clear river. He taught him to read the stars, not as a shepherd seeking his way, but as an astronomer reading the dispatches of the heavens. But this river of love, no matter how profound, flowed inevitably into a sea that had frozen into eternal ice within Sarah's heart. Sarah watched him, her gaze not that of a stepmother, but of a sentry guarding a treasure that had never existed. Every peal of Ishmael's laughter, every intelligent answer he gave to the elders' questions, every warm embrace Abraham bestowed upon him, was a cold pebble dropped into the still pool of her silent grief. She did not truly hate the boy. Perhaps she hated his presence as a mirror, one that reflected her own perceived failure and impatience. She hated how effortlessly he possessed the one thing she had spent a lifetime praying for in vain. Her silence was a wall of ice, and Ishmael, in the luminous innocence of childhood, ran into that invisible wall again and again, without understanding why. He would bring her a rare wildflower found after a rain, only to receive a curt nod and a distant gaze. He would excitedly tell her of a lizard with strange, beautiful colors he had just seen, only to meet eyes that looked straight through him, fixed on an empty, barren future. This was not a simple story of a rejected child. This was the story of a young soul being slowly poisoned by silence. A war without weapons waged every day beneath the searing Canaanite sun. And the greatest tragedy had not yet begun. It was merely waiting, like a patient predator, for a single spark to set the tinder of exhausted patience ablaze. Then one day, into the almost eternal stillness of the plains of Mamre, the desert wind brought 3 uninvited guests. They did not arrive on towering camels, nor did they carry the gleaming weapons or noisy entourage of wealthy travelers. They came on foot, their garments as simple as any wayfarers, yet there was something in their eyes, a stillness, a depth that held the permanence of ancient mountains, an authority not of this world. Abraham, a man in whose veins hospitality flowed as a sacred inheritance, rushed out to greet them, bowing low, entirely unaware that he was standing at the threshold of destiny, a turning point that would alter the course of history. He ushered them to the shade of the most generous terebinth tree, called for servants to bring water to wash their feet, and personally selected the finest, tenderest calf to be prepared for a feast. As the visitors sat, partaking of the milk, bread, and roasted veal, an air of solemnity settled over the camp. Then one of them spoke. His voice was not loud, not booming, but it carried an invisible weight, a power that caused all other sounds to cease. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," he declared. "And Sarah, your wife, will have a son." The proclamation was like a stone dropped into a quiet well, its ripples spreading to the farthest corners of the encampment. From within the tent, where she was listening, as was the custom, Sarah heard it. A laugh escaped her throat. It was not the sound of joy or happy surprise. It was a dry, cynical sound, like the scrape of gravel in a long, dry riverbed. It was the laugh of decades of disappointment, of countless nights spent in silent tears, of a womb that had become a tomb for hope. "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" she muttered to herself, a bitter monologue from a soul grown weary. But that murmur, as quiet as it was, did not escape the visitor's ears. He calmly asked Abraham, his gaze seeming to pierce the very fabric of the tent, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Adid. Heavy silence fell over the entire camp. Sarah, terrified, scrambled to deny it. "I did not laugh," she insisted, but the visitor replied gently, his voice without accusation but filled with an undeniable certainty. "No, but you did laugh." That promise, like a sandstorm appearing suddenly on the horizon, rose up and swept everything into its vortex. For Abraham, it was the confirmation of a faith that had begun to fray, a light at the end of a long tunnel. But for Sarah, it was both a miracle and a curse. Hope, that dangerous emotion she had tried so hard to bury beneath the ashes of despair, began to stir, demanding to live again. And alongside hope, another seed was planted in the barren soil of her soul, the dark, poisonous seed of exclusion. If she truly had a son, the son of the promise, the rightful heir, then what would Ishmael become? He would become a shadow, a living reminder of her impatience, a potential threat to her own son's singular inheritance. Hagar, watching from a distance, felt the shift in the atmosphere. She had not heard the promise, but she saw Sarah's eyes as she emerged from the tent. They were no longer empty. They now held a strange, new light, a cold and sharp determination. The whisper of the sandstorm had arrived, and it would soon tear apart the small, fragile world she and her son had called home. The months passed like sand through an hourglass, and the miracle became flesh. Under a canopy of 1,000 stars, the cry of a newborn baby tore through the stillness of the camp. Isaac, whose name means laughter, was born, and Sarah laughed. But this time, it was not the laughter of cynicism, but of pure, unadulterated release, of overwhelming joy. Her tears, mingling with the sound to create a song of thanksgiving, Abraham's encampment was plunged into a celebration unlike any it had ever known. Feasts lasted for days. Songs of praise were sung, and every eye, every word of blessing, was directed at the newborn child, the precious jewel of the promise, the future of a nation. Ishmael, now a tall and thoughtful adolescent, stood at the edge of this circle of happiness. There was no envy in his heart, only a deep and profound confusion, a vague sense of displacement. He loved his baby brother, with his soft skin and innocent eyes, but he felt like a bright star, suddenly rendered invisible by the glorious blaze of the rising sun. His father's attention, once his alone, was now divided, and he felt the invisible wall between himself and Sarah growing colder and higher than ever before. On the day of Isaac's weaning, a great feast was held, a momentous occasion marking a child's passage from infancy. As the camp celebrated with music and dance, Ishmael sat alone in a quiet corner of the courtyard, where the sand was fine and smooth. With his innate skill and a vivid imagination, he began to draw with his finger upon this sandy canvas. He did not draw trivial things, like camels or palm trees. He was recreating a grand story, the very story his father had told him countless times around the campfire. His fingers moved with grace and precision, sketching the figures of 3 majestic visitors, a tent, a woman laughing from within, and then a newborn child bathed in glory. It was an innocent work of art, a gift he intended for his little brother, a way for him, the outsider, to participate in the family's collective joy. But when Sarah, her face radiant with happiness, happened to walk by and saw the drawings in the sand, her smile vanished. In her eyes, this was not an act of innocence. It was an act of brazen appropriation. She saw Ishmael, the son of the handmaiden, retelling the sacred story of Isaac, making his divine legacy his own. The boy from the outside was daring to touch the inheritance of the son of freedom. It was an unforgivable offense, a blasphemy, the final spark that ignited the powder keg of insecurity and jealousy that had been accumulating for years. Cast out this slave woman and her son. Her voice was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice, aimed directly at Abraham's heart. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son, with Isaac. Abraham felt the ground beneath his feet crumble into an abyss. Cast out Ishmael, the child he had taught to walk, the son who carried his blood, the boy he loved so deeply. His heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. But that night, in the dense silence of his grief, a voice greater than his own pain spoke to him. Do not be distressed because of the boy and your slave woman. I will make a nation of the son of the handmaiden also, because he is your offspring. The next dawn was a broken dawn. Abraham, his eyes, those of a man who had wept until no tears were left, summoned Hagar and Ishmael. He gave them a skin of water and a few loaves of bread. It was not provision for a journey. It was the symbol of a bond being severed, a cold act of abandonment. He could not bring himself to look into Ishmael's eyes, which were still wide with a confusion he could not comprehend. The boy saw only a bottomless, nameless pain in his father's face. There was no farewell. No final embrace. There was only the sound of Hagar's and Ishmael's footsteps, heavy and alone, growing fainter and fainter until they were 2 tiny specks swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert. Behind them, the drawing in the sand had already been erased by the morning wind, just as their place in the family had been erased forever. The desert is not an empty space. It is a living entity, a patient and colossal predator. The sun is its single, fiery eye, relentlessly beating down, draining life. The wind is its dry, rasping breath, carrying hot sand that stings the flesh. For Hagar and Ishmael, the desert became a prison without walls, a death sentence without a hangman. The skin of water, Abraham's final, heartbreaking gift, soon went flat and then empty. The last loaves of bread became as hard as stone, impossible to swallow. Hope, like the water, evaporated under the merciless heat, leaving behind a terrifying void. The thirst was no longer a mere physical sensation in the throat. It became a psychological tormentor, gnawing at their minds and spirits. The desert began to play cruel games with them. Mirages of shimmering lakes and green oases appeared on the horizon, planting a fragile seed of hope only to vanish as they staggered closer. The whistling of the wind through the rocks began to sound like mocking laughter. Hagar, though accustomed to a harsh climate, began to fail. She stumbled, her feet swollen, her mind delirious. Ishmael, the strong youth of yesterday, was now a gaunt shadow, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes glazed over with a dull film. Finally, his legs would obey, his will no longer. He collapsed, a heap of exhausted limbs, onto the scorching sand. Hagar, with a choked cry, used the very last of her strength to drag her son into the meager shade of a withered shrub. The shade was as thin as a spider's web, but it was all she could offer. Then, in the deepest abyss of despair, she did something no mother should ever have to do. She turned her back on her child and walked away, a bow shot's distance, far enough not to witness the final, terrible moment. Let me not see the death of the child." She sobbed, burying her face in the hot sand. Her weeping was no longer tears. It was the silent scream of a soul utterly broken. Ishmael lay there, his breathing shallow, his chest barely rising and falling. He was drifting on the fragile border between life and death. His body had surrendered. He no longer had the strength to cry out, no strength to call for his mother. But in the depths of his fading consciousness, where the last embers of memory flickered, another sound arose. It was not a scream for life. It was a whisper, a prayer formed, not of words, but of the final fragments of his memory, his father's pained face, the stars his father had taught him to read, and the name an angel had given him before he was born. God has heard. That whisper, fainter than a breath, held a phenomenal power. It pierced the dead silence of the desert, rose above Hagar's muffled sobs, and ascended to the heavens like an invisible arrow. And God, who sits enthroned above, heard it. A voice called out, not from the earth, not from the wind, but seeming to come from the very sky itself. "What is the matter? Hagar, do not be afraid. God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." Hagar lifted her head in astonishment, and then, a miracle. Her tired, tear-blurred eyes were opened. Directly in front of her, where moments before there had been only sand and rock, was a well of water, clear and sparkling in the sun like a diamond. The water had not magically appeared. It had been there all along. It was only that despair had blinded her to its presence. She scrambled to her feet. Her legs, suddenly filled with strength, filled the water skin and rushed back to her son. The cool, life-giving water flowed into Ishmael's mouth, and miraculously, life flowed back into his body. The whisper in the thirst had been answered. The rejected boy had been redeemed, not by man, but by the one who listens to the faintest melody of a dying soul. Survival at the well was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the start of a new chapter, one that would be written, not with ink, but with resilience and knowledge. The desert, the very entity that had nearly consumed them, must now, by some divine irony, become their home and their teacher. Hagar, the woman from Egypt, was no longer a passive handmaiden. Within her, the wisdom of her ancestors, people who had tamed the Nile and thrived for millennia in arid lands, awoke with formidable strength. She did not just teach Ishmael how to survive. She taught him how to listen to the desert, how to understand its language and rhythms, turning it from an enemy into an ally. Drawing upon the knowledge of her homeland, she showed him which roots held water for days, which leaves could be made into a poultice to soothe a burn, how to read the tracks of scorpions and vipers in order to avoid them. She taught him how to read the direction of the wind, not to flee from it, but to predict the weather, to find shelter. Ishmael, with his innate powers of observation and an intellect sharpened by adversity, absorbed it all. The desert was no longer a foe. It became a great master, harsh in its lessons, but utterly just in its rewards. One day, a violent sandstorm, a simoom feared by all nomads, swept across their territory. The sky turned a sickly yellow, and the wind howled like a wounded beast, nearly burying their makeshift shelter. When the storm finally subsided, leaving behind an eerie, ringing silence, they saw that an ancient acacia tree, a symbol of desert endurance, had had a great bough torn from its trunk by the wind's fury. The branch lay on the sand like a broken bone. Hagar, instead of seeing it as firewood for the cold nights, looked upon it with different eyes. She carefully carried the bough back to their camp and began a patient process of healing. She used fragrant tree sap to seal the cracks and the strongest vines she could find to slowly bend the wood into a perfect, powerful curve. Each day, she would tighten the vines a little more, whispering to the wood words of life. That which is broken, she told Ishmael, if healed with love and patience, becomes stronger than it was before. And from that broken branch, Ishmael's first bow was born, It was not merely a weapon for hunting, it was a living symbol of rebirth. The first time Ishmael tried to draw the bow, his arm trembled, and his homemade arrow flew wide, landing weakly in the sand. But he was not discouraged. Day after day, he practiced under the blazing sun, his breath synchronizing with the rhythm of the desert. He learned to feel the wind on his skin, to hold his breath and still his mind and body before releasing the string. His hands became calloused and raw, then healed, then calloused again. His shoulders grew broad and strong. Then one day, he stood firm, drew back the string, and took a deep breath. The arrow flew, silent and true, slicing through the air and embedding itself deep into a distant cactus. It was more than a successful shot. It was the moment Ishmael truly found himself. He was no longer Abraham's rejected son, nor was he the boy who nearly died in the wilderness. He was Ishmael of the desert, a hunter, a protector, a survivor. The bow in his hands was an extension of his will, and every arrow he loosed was a defiant declaration that he would never be broken again. He had been reborn from the sand, healed by his mother's love, and armed by the very forces that had tried to destroy him. Time in the desert is measured not by clocks, but by the cycles of the moon, the scars on the rocks, and the generations of men. Ishmael, the lone youth, grew into a rugged man, a husband, and then a father. The Egyptian wife Hagar had journeyed so far to find for him a woman who understood the silence and strength of the sand, bore him 12 sons. But these were not 12 ordinary children, raised in the comfort of city walls. They were 12 seeds sown in the harshest soil on earth, watered with sweat and tears, and they grew into 12 mighty, resilient trees, their roots anchored deep in the heart of the desert. Ishmael did not teach his sons how to build palaces or hoard gold. He passed on to them a different philosophy, one born from his own life story. He taught them how to create a kingdom without walls. Walls, he would often say around the campfire, create prisoners, both those within and those left without. Our freedom lies not in the land we possess, but in our ability to move, in the paths we forge. And so, his 12 sons did not become princes dressed in silk. They became chieftains of 12 nomadic tribes, 12 living banners woven not of cloth, but of wind and sand. Each son, with his unique character, developed his tribe along a distinct path, creating a diverse yet strangely unified mosaic. Nebaioth, the firstborn, inherited his father's quiet wisdom. He became the keeper of their history and ancient traditions. His tribe became renowned throughout the lands for its hospitality and sage counsel. Kedar, the second son, was a born warrior. As fierce and proud as a desert lion, his tribe consisted of the most skilled archers, a shield for their brother tribes. Their tents, woven from black goat hair, became a symbol of strength and endurance. Adbeel and Mibsam, 2 brothers close in spirit, possessed a special talent for trade. They saw the desert not as a barrier, but as a bridge. They charted secret paths through the deadliest terrains, connecting the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, turning sand into gold and exchange into a bond of peace. And so it went with each of the remaining sons, from Mishma, Duma, and Massa to Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. One specialized in breeding the strongest camels, another became master craftsmen of leather and metal. They did not have a nation with fixed borders drawn by blood and iron. Their territory was the trade routes they controlled, the green oases they nurtured, the precious wells they defended with their lives. They had no laws carved on stone tablets, but they had an unwritten code of honor passed down orally through the generations, where a man's word was more valuable than gold, and betrayal was the greatest sin. They were a people of movement, a constant current in the ocean of sand. When a powerful enemy approached, they did not mass for a direct confrontation. They melted into the desert like water into sand, vanishing without a trace. Then, when the enemy was weary and complacent, they would emerge from all directions like phantoms, striking swiftly before disappearing again. These 12 tribes, these 12 banners of wind, together created a new melody in the desert, a song of freedom, resilience, and an indomitable people who would never bow their heads. Ishmael's fame spread across the arid lands, not as a bloodthirsty conqueror, but as a natural phenomenon, a mountain that had risen from the flat sands. Caravans passing through his domains told tales of him with a mixture of awe and respect. It was said he could hear a snake slithering in the sand from a mile away, that his arrows could find their mark even in a blinding sandstorm. But those who truly knew him understood that his greatest power lay not in his bow, but in a wisdom as deep as the desert itself. He had become a king who needed no throne, a mediator whose words were more powerful than swords, a judge whose justice was more precious than jewels. He ruled not by fear, but by the respect he had earned. A fiery dispute erupted between two of his most powerful tribes, the warrior tribe of Kedar and the wise tribe of Nebaioth. The cause of the conflict was the right to use a vital well, known as the Heart of the Oasis, which was strategically located between their territories. Harsh words had been exchanged, swords had been drawn from their sheaths, and blood was about to be spilled. The fragile alliance between Ishmael's sons, the very foundation of their people, was on the verge of shattering. Instead of summoning an army or sending messengers, Ishmael, alone and dressed in his simple robes, rode his old camel to the place of contention. His mere presence immediately doused the tense atmosphere. Even the most hot-headed warriors sheathed their weapons and bowed their heads. He took no sides. He listened to no accusations. He silently walked to the edge of the well, knelt, and scooped up a handful of damp sand, letting it slowly trickle through his fingers. All eyes were on him, awaiting his judgment. Then he spoke, his voice low and resonant. "My father, and yours," he began, once nearly died of thirst beside a shrub. At that moment, water was not a right. Water was a miracle, a grace. Water is not something to be owned. It is a gift to be shared. This well belongs not to Kedar, nor to Nebaioth. It belongs to thirst. It belongs to all who need it to sustain life. Then he offered a solution, not a verdict, but a suggestion, simple yet profound. He proposed that the two tribes not divide the well, but serve it together as a sacred duty. The tribe of Kedar, with its mighty warriors, would be responsible for protecting the well from outside raiders and foreign tribes. They would be the guardians of the heart of the oasis. The tribe of Nebaioth, with its wisdom and organization, would be responsible for maintaining the well, keeping it clean, and ensuring the fair distribution of its water, not just to the two tribes, but to any passing caravan. By transforming an object of conflict into a shared responsibility, a common honor, Ishmael extinguished the flames of hatred. He did not command. He merely illuminated a wiser path. The chieftains of the two tribes looked at each other, the hostility in their eyes replaced by understanding and shame. They approached together and bowed deeply before their father. They had learned a valuable lesson. True power is not the ability to control others, but the ability to create harmony. From that day on, Ishmael became the final arbiter of all disputes in his kingdom, without walls. Other tribes brought their most complex problems before him, and he always found a solution by looking at the root of the issue, at human need, rather than the surface of the conflict. He was a king with no crown, no palace, and no army. But his kingdom, the kingdom of peace and honor, was secure in the hearts of an entire people. Time erodes even mountains, and it does not spare great men. Many years later, when Ishmael was an old patriarch with hair as white as salt, news crossed the desert like a cold wind in summer, carrying with it a profound sorrow. Abraham, the friend of God, the patriarch of the promise, the torchbearer of faith for an entire age, had breathed his last in the arms of Isaac. When the news reached Ishmael, he was sitting before his tent, his gnarled hands slowly refeathering an old arrow. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, toward Canaan. He spoke no word, but his aged wife, Hagar, could see a storm gathering in his quiet eyes. Without being commanded, without being urged, he simply rose, donned his plainest robes, and set out alone. His old camel seemed to sense the sorrow, its steps slow and heavy on the sand. He arrived at Isaac's encampment just as his younger brother, now a venerable patriarch himself, was preparing for the burial. The two brothers, one, the personification of the boundless desert, the other, the master of green pastures, stood face to face over the body of their shared father. Decades of separation, a lifetime of different paths and silent wounds, all seemed to dissolve in that moment. A deep silence enveloped them, but this time it was not the silence of hostility or distance, but of a shared grief, a loss too profound for words. Isaac, the son of the inheritance, had prepared the finest linen shrouds, the most precious spices. Ishmael, the son of the desert, brought something different, something no amount of wealth could buy. He slowly placed a worn leather water skin beside the body. Inside was water from the very well that had saved him and his mother in the desert so many years ago. Isaac looked at his brother, whom he barely knew, with surprise. In response, Ishmael simply gave a solemn nod. Isaac understood. An understanding that required no words passed between them. He went into his tent and returned a moment later with a handful of earth. It was soil from Mount Moriah, the place where he had once lain upon an altar, ready to accept his father's knife in the ultimate test of faith. At the cave of Machpelah, where Sarah already rested, the two sons together, shoulder to shoulder, lowered their father into his final resting place. Before the servants moved to seal the cave, Ishmael stepped forward. He slowly opened the water skin and poured the clear water from his well of survival over Abraham's body, the water of a promise rejected, yet still honored by God. Immediately after, Isaac stepped forward, gently opened his hand, and sprinkled the soil from his mountain of obedience over his father. The water of the desert's tears mingled with the dust of absolute faith. It was a sacred and intensely private moment, a ritual whose meaning only the two of them could fully comprehend. No words of reconciliation were spoken, no embrace was shared, but through that symbolic act, they had acknowledged each other's legacy and each other's pain. They acknowledged that they were both products of their father's extraordinary faith and his agonizing trials. They were two different paths that had sprung from the same great mountain of faith. When the ceremony was over, Ishmael did not stay. He turned, silently mounted his camel, and headed back toward the desert, back to his world. Their paths were, and would forever be, separate. But at that grave, for one brief, eternal moment, the two halves of a complex legacy had met, not to merge, but to honor together in the most profound way, the source from which they both came. Ishmael left behind no pyramids to defy time, no stone cities with fortified walls, no laws carved on steles for the world to admire. His legacy was something entirely different, something both tangible and intangible, a legacy written in the wind, told by firelight, and etched upon the endless roads of the desert. His descendants, the Ishmaelite tribes, did not conquer the world with armies. They connected it. They became the undisputed masters of the desert, the captains of the sandy ocean, the operators of the first silk roads of the sand. By the wisdom passed down from their great father and the experience accumulated over generations, they knew every water source, whether a deep well or a small pool left after a rain. They knew every natural shelter that could offer refuge from a sandstorm, every safe passage through treacherous mountain ranges, caravans laden with precious spices from the east, gold and ivory from the south, textiles and pottery from the north. All had to rely on the guidance and protection of the Ishmaelite tribes to cross the desert safely. They did not levy taxes by force. They provided an indispensable service, a guarantee backed by honor, and in return received respect and fair trade. Theirs was a culture of adaptability. Their goat hair tents could be dismantled and erected in a matter of hours, allowing them to move with the seasons, with the water, with the flow of trade. Their knowledge was not stored in cumbersome libraries. It resided in their poems, their epic songs, their stories, recited from memory around the campfire each night. They were poets, musicians, and storytellers. They kept the memory of their forefather Ishmael, their courageous grandmother Hagar, and the sacred story of the life-saving well alive, transforming it into their founding myth, an identity that could not be erased. They were proud of their origins, of the blood of the man who had turned rejection into a kingdom of freedom. Their influence became so great that even the prophets of the kingdom of Israel, in their sacred scrolls, had to mention them. Isaiah wrote of the glory of Kedar, of their abundant flocks and mighty warriors. Jeremiah spoke of the kingdoms of Arabia, the descendants of Ishmael. Ezekiel listed the wares the Ishmaelite tribes brought to trade in the bustling port city of Tyre. The tribes of Ishmael were no longer the forgotten people of the wilderness. They had become a significant, unavoidable power on the geopolitical chessboard of the ancient world. They were the most vibrant and powerful living proof of the promise God had made to Hagar beside a well so long ago. "I will so multiply your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." Ishmael's legacy was not a physical kingdom that could be destroyed by time or war. His legacy was an idea, a philosophy of life. The idea that freedom is not found in where you are, but in how you live. That strength comes not from building high walls, but from knowing how to cross all barriers. His legacy was a nomadic melody, powerful and proud, a song written in the wind, and it would echo forever across the deserts of the world, whispering the story of a man who turned a curse into a blessing. Old age came to Ishmael, not like a storm, but gently, like the setting of the sun over the desert, painting the sky in glorious colors, before slowly giving way to the stillness of the night. His hair was as white as the salt flats, and his skin was a roadmap of a life lived under the sun and wind, each line a story, a memory of hardship and triumph. But his eyes remained clear and as deep as the star-filled night sky, holding the wisdom of a man who had lived a full life, a life shaped by human rejection, but perfected by divine grace. He had completed his journey from a cast-out boy to a revered patriarch, the father of a people. He had seen God's promise to him fulfilled in wondrous ways. One evening, as the first stars began to glitter like scattered diamonds on black velvet, Ishmael gathered his descendants around him, from his sons, now old chieftains themselves, to his youngest great-grandchildren. He was not lying on a sickbed inside his tent. He sat upright before its entrance, the place from which he had watched the desert for so many years. His old bow, the symbol of his rebirth, rested in a place of honor beside him. The flickering light from the central campfire danced across his face, illuminating the noble lines of a remarkable life. An air of solemn reverence fell upon the gathering, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the tents. He did not recount his great victories or his conquests. He did not divide his possessions or issue final laws. He told a story, the story of the beginning of it all. He spoke of a boy dying of thirst under a shrub, of a mother who could not bear to watch her son die, and of a faint whisper, a final prayer that had reached the heavens and been heard. "My name is Ishmael," he said, his old voice low but clear, resonating in the silence. "It means God hears. My children, and my children's children, carry this in your hearts as you carry water in your skins. Never forget it. In the darkest moments of your lives, when you feel abandoned, when you think no one in this world cares for your existence, when your own voice is no more than a faint whisper in the wind, Remember, there is one who always hears. That was his last will and testament, the greatest inheritance he could leave to his lineage. He looked one last time at all the beloved faces surrounding him, then lifted his eyes to the starry sky, where he had learned his first lesson about the greatness of the Creator and the humility of man. A serene, contented smile touched his dry lips. Then he gently leaned his head back against the tent pole and breathed his last, as peacefully as a weary traveler sinking into a deep sleep after a long and meaningful journey. They did not bury him in a sealed cave. Following his wishes, they carried him to a high dune, a place where the wind could blow freely from all four corners of the earth, a place where he could forever watch over his kingdom without walls. They built no tomb of gold or precious stone. They simply and silently placed 12 large, rough desert stones in a circle around his resting place, symbolizing the 12 tribes, the 12 banners of wind he had brought into being. Ishmael was gone. His body returned to the dust, but his story was not. It merged with the melody of the sand, with the whisper of the wind, with the eternal light of the stars. The story of a rejected outcast who became the father of nations, the story of a whisper that became an immortal epic, and it remains an everlasting reminder to all who feel forgotten that even in the most vast and lonely silence, there is always one who is listening